every detective knows that sometimes the most important clue is the one that's hiding in plain sight, and our featured plant fits that profile perfectly. We usually treat this knobby little root as a boring side dish, but the forensic evidence tells a much more complicated story. This is a plant that managed to trick the world into dependence, triggering a population explosion that walked a very thin line between survival and total collapse. I'm Megan Brame, and on this episode of The History of Plants, we're following the trail of the potato, Solanum tuberosum, from a bitter mountain nightshade to a global staple powerful enough to tip the balance between boom and famine, life and extinction. You've seen it mashed, fried, and smothered in gravy, but you almost never see it as the main character in a story of conquest, catastrophe, and quiet survival. To figure out how a plant gets that kind of leverage over humanity, we have to start where the air is thin, the soil is mean, and the only way anything lives is by evolving tricks sharp enough to keep its hunters on their toes. The first thing you should know is the potato comes from the wrong side of the tracks, with a family that might be even more toxic than yours at Thanksgiving dinner. It belongs to the Solanaceae family, which means it grew up alongside tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, and some of the most dangerous plants in the hemisphere, like deadly nightshade, boysenberry, and Jimson weed. The potato began as a genetic accident. A recent genomic study revealed that the potato originated from a chance hybridization event around 9 million years ago, where a wild tomato ancestor crossed with another potato-like plant called E. tuberosum. What came from that were these wild ancestors that were small, hard as rocks, and often bitter, using that taste to poison anything or anyone that tried to eat them. This creates a bit of a puzzle for anthropologists, because why would anyone bother domesticating a plant that is actively trying to kill you? And when did they start? Tracing this timeline isn't easy because the potato is a master at hiding its tracks. Unlike corn cobs or animal bones, tubers are made of soft tissue that rots instead of fossilizing. So to find the answer, we have to get out the microscopes. You might assume that our journey begins in Ireland, but the earliest evidence we have comes from Escalante, or Escalant as native Utahns call it, where archaeologists found potato starch residues on stone tools that are around 11,000 years old. These weren't the domesticated potato that we know, though. It's a wild relative called Solanum jamesii. While it's not our potato, it still proves that humans in the Americas were figuring out how to process these toxic tubers before the first city was built, which we think was around 10,000 years ago in Mesopotamia. But the real breakthrough happens in the Andes. We believe indigenous farmers started the slow, careful process of transforming this toxic biological luck of the draw into the food source that we know and love today, roughly 7 to 10,000 years ago. At a site called Huaycarumocu in Peru, researchers at UC Merced analyzed ancient grinding stones and found microscopic starch grains trapped in the tiny crevices that had a specific off-center growth pattern called a hilum, which is unique to domesticated potatoes. So we go from 7-ish thousand years ago of agricultural experimentation to now seeing the first signs of our tuberosum potato at least 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. Eventually, these farmers created over 4,000 distinct land races. These aren't like the modern supermarket potatoes. A land race is a genetically diverse population of plants that has adapted to survive in one specific place, like a single valley or a certain altitude. It's a massive library of genetics with different shapes and colors designed to survive specific microclimates on the mountain. But growing food is only half the battle. You also have to store it. Around 3,000 years ago, the Tiwanaku culture in modern-day Bolivia and Peru revolutionized agriculture with two major inventions. First, they built tsucacayos, massive raised fields separated by irrigation canals that created their own warm microclimates to protect crops from frost. Then they invented freeze-drying. By exposing potatoes to the freezing night air and then the scorching daytime sun, and then stomping on them to remove moisture, they created two types of preserved tubers. There was chuño, the black sun-dried potato, and tunta, the white version. Chuño and tunta are incredibly light, resistant to mold, and can be stored for years, sometimes decades. They're packed with calcium and iron, and while the process still loses some antioxidants as compared to fresh potatoes, it created a stable, long-term food supply that allowed civilizations to weather droughts and famines that would have otherwise wiped out their culture. It was a perfect closed system, turning the potato into a caloric engine that allowed civilization to thrive in the thin mountain air. From there, we fast forward to 16th century when the Spanish arrived, saw the strange root that appeared to be a staple for the indigenous people, and decided to throw it on a boat and send it back home. The potato was about to go global, but Europe was not ready for what was coming. The first time a European officially went on the record about the potato, he didn't call it a potato, he called it a truffle. In 1537, the Spanish conquistador Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada was raiding villages in modern-day Colombia when his men found a strange round root in the local homes. In his report, he called them tormas de tierra, or earth truffles. They were small, they grew underground, and looked a bit like the expensive fungi back home, but when they brought this truffle back to Europe around the 1570s, the rebranding did not stick. Instead of a delicacy, Europe treated it like a biological weapon. But you have to look at it from a medieval perspective. Here was a plant that wasn't mentioned in the Bible, and it grew underground, literally towards hell, rather than upward towards heaven like wheat. And most damning of all, it looked like its toxic cousin, belladonna. So the potato sat in the background getting essentially canceled in medieval culture. People claimed it caused leprosy. They said it caused scrofula, an infection in the lymph nodes that can lead to tuberculosis. In 1748, the Parliament of Paris actually made it illegal to grow them because the government was convinced they would cause disease and poison the soil. It took a specialized kind of detective work and perhaps a little reverse psychology to clear its name. Enter the Prussian king Frederick the Great. During his reign, Frederick made optimizing land use a priority and turned around 150,000 acres of Prussian land and swamp into farmland. The goal was to reduce famine in his kingdom, though it caused drastic problems for the region's biodiversity, but that wasn't really a big thing back then, especially when your people are starving. Also, as a little fun fact, he's credited with creating the first veterinary school in Prussia as he was a big animal lover. Frederick realized early on that the potato could solve his famine problems, issuing 15 different decrees that ordered peasants to plant them and turnips. But his subjects were skeptical. So, allegedly, he tried a new tactic. There's a story that he planted a royal potato field and posted guards around it with secret orders to look the other way if anyone tried to sneak in. He knew the golden rule of human nature, that if you want someone to want something, tell them they can't have it. However, some historians dispute this happened, so take this as a fun little fable more than factual evidence. Regardless of the method, the mass adoption worked and earned him the name of the Potato King. Not only was this important for the people, obviously, but it's also important anthropologically because it's considered one of the best examples of the new Enlightenment attitude, where a monarch prioritized science, agriculture, and the needs of his subjects over tradition and decorum. One of the people watching this happen was a French prisoner of war and pharmacist named Antoine Augustin Parmentier. During the 7 Years' War, he was captured by Prussian military forces and was forced to survive on a diet of potatoes while in captivity. When he didn't die and actually stayed quite healthy, he realized he was sitting on a caloric gold mine. In 1763, he was released and returned to France, where he launched a PR campaign to rehab the potato's reputation that would make any modern marketing firm jealous. At first, he started with what they believed at the time were low stakes, feeding it to people with dysentery and seeing how they reacted. But he knew there could be a wider acceptance if he just nailed the messaging. While Frederick's approach was forceful and utilitarian, Parmentier decided to take a more luxury goods route and turn the potato into something aspirational. His first tactic was convincing King Louis XVI to wear potato flowers in his buttonhole, making them a new fashion statement. But his other approach, which was just brilliant marketing all around, was hosting 20-course all-potato dinner parties for the elite, with notable guests like Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson. There's a story that Jefferson was so enthralled, he took the recipe for what would later be called French fries back to the U.S. and began serving it at the White House for state dinners. Anyhow, back in France, the trick worked. In 1772, Parliament repealed the potato ban, and by the 1800s, the potato had gone from suspect to a savior. It effectively powered the workforce of the Industrial Revolution, allowing Europe's population to explode. Oh, also, if you're learning something new today, why not hit subscribe? New episodes drop every other week. But as the potato conquered Europe, a massive problem was forming. Remember those 4,000 distinct landraces in the Andes? That genetic library that protected the crop? Yeah, the Spanish didn't bring that library back to Europe. They just brought a handful of tubers. And nowhere did the potato take over faster or more completely than Ireland. Let's set the stage. Ireland suffered from widespread wealth inequality, where landlords would lease land to middlemen who then split them into smaller plots and charged exorbitant rents, in addition to exploiting the tenants. Families were often left with selling the majority of their crops to survive and using small gardens, which were typically less than an acre, to feed their family. While you might think, hey, my garden is way less than an acre, you've also got to keep in mind that there were no grocery stores to go to. And let's remember the stereotype of the Irish back then is that they were, well, a fruitful people. At the time, it's estimated Ireland had a population of 8 million, all with mouths to feed and many with very meager resources to do so. In a landscape where rural families were living off of very small plots, the potato had the crucial advantage of producing a massive amount of calories in a tiny footprint and could grow in conditions that would otherwise punish fussier crops. Over time, that practically hardened into dependence. The potato became the daily foundation that everything else was built around. And because the system rewarded reliability, one variety started to dominate, the Irish lumper. When Ireland became part of the UK in 1801, it was able to send a little over 130 representatives to Parliament. However, the majority of those who served were wealthy aristocrats who had little knowledge of how to work the lands or could see the warning signs on the horizon of what was to come. Benjamin Disraeli, a future prime minister, said the country had, quote, a starving population, an absentee aristocracy, an alien established Protestant church, and, in addition, the weakest executive in the world, meaning the Lord Lieutenant and Chief Secretary of Ireland, who at the time were William McCourt and Sir Thomas Fremantle, respectively. So, by the 1840s, you have a whole country leaning on one staple, and that staple leaning on one genetic profile, combined with greedy landlords and middlemen, plus government representatives totally ignorant to the specific problems that their constituents faced. There was concern, but they just didn't know how to help their people. Over 100 commissions and 60 special committees had been created to deal with the food crises, yet nothing had been done to change the country's course in a meaningful way. And then comes 1845, when a water mold called Phytophthora infestans, better known as late blight, arrived as a stowaway from North America during a particularly cold and moist period of weather, which is its ideal breeding ground. And because every potato in Ireland was a clone, once it got a hold of one, it knew how to infect the others. The lumpers completely lacked the diversity that might have created a natural resistance to it. In 1846, Lord John Russell became the UK's Prime Minister. Russell was an interesting person who favored moving the country away from aristocratic rule and expanding the vote to the middle class. However, he was also a firm believer in the government keeping out of things, believing that the market would correct whatever issue the people faced. Instead of focusing on the starvation crisis happening in Ireland, Russell's government continued programs that moved food from the country to England, while shutting down public works programs and food aid that were created by past parliamentary bodies. So, you've got the perfect storm: mass starvation, low wages, disease, greedy wealthy, and a hands-off government leaving the people to fend for themselves with whatever they had left. And whatever they had left was turning into black slime right in front of their eyes. From 1846 to 1849, the blight moved through the landscape like a wildfire, and the stench of rotting vegetation was so thick it made people retch. Eyewitness accounts from the time sound like the aftermath of a war. There are some truly harrowing first-hand accounts that I'll leave a link to in the pinned comment, but this one really gives you an example of just how widespread and decimating this time was for the Irish. Nicholas Cummins, a magistrate from Cork, visited the town of Skibbereen and said, quote, I entered some of the hovels, and the scenes which presented themselves were such that no tongue or pen can convey the slightest idea of. In the first, 6 famished and ghastly skeletons, to all appearances dead, were huddled in a corner on some filthy straw. their sole covering what seemed a ragged horse cloth, their wretched legs hanging about naked above the knees. I approached with horror and found by a low moaning they were alive. They were in fever, 4 children, a woman, and what had once been a man. It is impossible to go through the detail. Suffice it to say that in a few minutes I was surrounded by at least 200 such phantoms, such frightful specters as no words can describe, suffering either from famine or from fever. Their demonic yells are still ringing in my ears, and their horrible images are fixed upon my brain. Once the blight became rampant, the crisis could no longer be ignored or put off, despite some pretty good efforts to pass the buck. Citizens from Dublin went to William a Court begging for intervention, suggesting things like allowing more food crops to be imported to improve food diversity and providing jobs through public work programs to stop the widespread poverty. A court waved them away, calling their concerns, quote, premature. In the span of a few years, over 1 million people died of starvation and disease, and at least another 1 million were forced to flee the country. Naturally, there were some waiting in the wings to reap the benefits of what this devastation was causing and used their powers to prevent intervention. Sir Charles Edward Trevelyan, the person in charge of doling out government assistance to the Irish, said in a private letter, quote, "We must not complain of what we really want to obtain. If small farmers go and their landlords are reduced to sell portions of their estates to persons who will invest capital, we shall at last arrive at something like a satisfactory settlement of the country." The Great Famine is often taught as a political tragedy, which it absolutely was, but it showed how relying on a single genetic suspect can be a death sentence. The potato had saved Europe from famine for a century, but in the end, it taught us the brutal lesson about biodiversity that we are still trying to learn today. But to understand why this plant is worth all the trouble and the risk, we have to look deep into its chemistry. On the surface, a potato is basically a wet battery of stored energy, which those of you who had to make potato batteries in school can probably attest to. It's mostly water and starch. But not all starch is created equal. The texture of your potato, whether it's a waxy red one that holds its shape in a salad or a russet that explodes into fluff after baking, comes down to the ratio of 2 specific molecules, amylose and amylopectin. High amylose makes the potato floury and dry, while high amylopectin makes it waxy and dense. It's a simple chemical switch that changes the entire culinary use of the vegetable. It's a very calorie-dense food, but calories are only half of the story. The real fuel that fed the European population boom are its vitamins. Historically, the European peasant diet consisted mainly of potatoes and milk, which may sound lacking, but it was actually pretty close to nutritionally complete. Potatoes are surprisingly high in vitamin C and vitamin B6, and they contain more potassium than a banana. When the potato was introduced to Europe, rates of scurvy, which is caused by vitamin C deficiencies, actually dropped. Turns out, incorporating the potato into the everyday diet was an accidental public health policy. But remember the bad neighborhood the potato grew up in? It never fully lost that familial weapon. The plant produces defense chemicals called glycoalkaloids, specifically alpha-solanine and alpha-chaconine, which are natural pesticides concentrated in the leaves, the stems, and, here's the important part, any part of the tuber that sees the sun. If you've ever seen a potato turn green, that's chlorophyll. The chlorophyll itself is harmless, it's just the plant trying to photosynthesize. But to us, that green color is a red flag because it means the potato is reacting to light, and where there is light, the potato starts pumping out solanine to protect itself. In high enough doses, that bitter solanine becomes neurotoxic, disrupting cell membranes and messing with the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Symptoms range from nausea and headaches to, in rare extreme cases, coma or death. So when we cut the green parts off, we're removing the plant's chemical defense system so we don't get hit with the fallout. Modern science is starting to ask if that weapon just could be aimed at another direction, and finding that the potato's chemical warfare chest is much deeper than we thought. For example, those same glycoalkaloids that are toxic to us, they're also nematocidal, meaning they kill parasitic worms in the soil, specifically alpha-chaconine, which has been shown to wipe out nematodes, which is a huge deal for organic pest control. We're also seeing potential in human medicine. 2015 study tested the antibacterial properties of potato peel extracts, specifically the ethanol-soluble parts, and found they can inhibit the growth of bacteria that causes staph infections. Other research has looked at selenum alkaloids as potential antivirals, showing activity against viruses like herpes simplex type 1. But the most impressive trick might be how the potato heals itself. When a tuber is cut or damaged, it doesn't just sit there and rot, it actively fights back. The potato triggers a burst burst of reactive oxygen species, ROS, basically chemical fire, to kill any invading microbes. This ramps up enzymes like superoxide dismutase and builds new corky skin called suberin around the wound. This process takes about 10 to 12 days, but once it's done, the potato is sealed up tight again. Scientists are very interested in this as potential ways to improve wound healing responses in crops. But my hope is that they can find a way to bring it over to humans too, which would be great for someone clumsy like me. It seems like no matter how many thousands of years we go back, we are still finding new ways for potatoes to surprise us, and it is happy to please. Today, the potato has gone from a suspicious immigrant to a citizen of the world. It is grown in over 160 countries and has become so deeply embedded in local cuisines that most people forget it isn't native. In China, which is now the world's largest producer of potatoes, it's known as tudo, or earth bean, and the government actively promotes it as a staple crop to ensure food security. In Russia, the potato garden at the dacha, family country house, remains a cultural symbol of survival and independence, a holdover from times when the state grocery stores were empty, but the backyard was full. It's even infiltrated our art and language. Van Gogh's famous painting, The Potato Eaters, isn't a pretty picture. It's a dark, rough testament to how this root vegetable became the fuel of the working class. And we can't ignore the pop culture rap sheet. We have Mr. Potato Head, which was the first toy ever advertised on television. Originally, you had to supply your own potato. The box just came with the plastic eyes and mouth to stab into it. We have Samwise in Lord of the Rings giving us the definitive recipe guide. Boil them, mash them, stick them in a stew. We even use it to describe ourselves. You can be a couch potato, have to deal quickly with a hot potato, or dismiss something as small potatoes. For bad photos in media, we say they were taken with a potato. It is so deeply ingrained in our lives that sometimes we forget how weird and unlikely of a crop companion it truly is. But the potato has one more final frontier left. In 1995, NASA and the University of Wisconsin-Madison made history by growing the first vegetable in space aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia. It was, of course, the potato. When you think about it, it makes perfect sense. The same traits that made it a survival crop for the Inca and the Irish, high calorie density, adaptability, growing in tight spaces, make it the perfect candidate for keeping astronauts alive on Mars. And yes, Matt Damon too. It's a strange trajectory. A toxic nightshade from the Andes became one of the engines of the Industrial Revolution, taught us a brutal lesson about biodiversity, and is now being auditioned for life on other planets. Turns out, the humble spud wasn't just a side dish. It was the main course of history all along. I'm Megan Brame. Thank you for joining me on another episode of The History of Plants. Jump into the commentary episode on Patreon to see what didn't make it, or if you thought the potatoes journey was wild, watch my deep dive on the history of corn. Until next time, greenies, stay curious, and don't forget to flourish.